Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to acknowledge that my co-author, Kishwan, is a graduate from Constance. He came to Yale, and we're very happy to have him at Yale. It's wonderful, and it's just great. We're also sending students here, so I'm just very happy about sort of this collaboration that we have between our universities. This is a little bit different than the title that was announced. I apologize for this, but I think we will get to the topic of militant democracy sort of in a way, in a side way. So this is a study on parliaments in periods of hard time, on parliaments when extremist actors are present and with a goal to undermine the functioning of parliaments. What I want to present is a typology, an understanding of the strategies of mainstream parties that can have sort of on problems on defending parliament, and the sort of a study of the coalitions under which sort of various forms of protection of parliament can come from. And as we know from Vincent Stepan, parliamentary erosion is the first symptom of democratic erosion, not just in interwar period, but also today, as I will show you. And we know that parliaments are relatively understudied, even though in a way they give us so much more data, there's so much more variation, there's so many more actors, yet in the literature we focus on executives and the executive aggrandizement, on sort of party strategies in the electoral arena, and on voters, but less so on what happens in parliaments. So here are some questions that I hope to address today. How does the presence of extremist parties modify parliamentary norms? What are the strategies, that is sort of my main interest, of mainstream parties towards extremist parties, and what are the trade-offs among these strategies? And what's the composition of the political coalitions supporting strategies of parliamentary defense? And I'm going to be drawing on 4 historical cases that I have worked on so far, and there are many more kind of in the present, and sort of they start with Weimar Germany, they include Third and Fourth Republic France, and then sort of Germany in the post-war period. And these sort of, I think the French-German comparison gives us a very, very interesting leverage. And just to highlight my talk, sort of, I mean, kind of there is much more action in France, sort of, than in Germany, and sort of, and French politicians take this very proactive role in kind of changing the electoral system in response to sort of the rise of extremist parties, whereas we do not see this response in Germany. So sort of so why? How do these kind of coalitions come about? So I think that is sort of an interesting and kind of an unexplored, in a way, historical comparison. So what do I mean by anti-parliamentarism? So so when we see when we read the statements of either communists parties or parties on the right, we see that their main goal of parliamentary participation is to engage in agitation, to undermine the sort of parliament themselves. This is comes from the KPD Party Congress in 1924 when they announced this strategy. But we also see this motivation among far-right actors. This is a statement here from the diary of Joseph Goebbels in 1926, the first day when he was in parliament, the plenary school. The plenary session, a school of angry Jews. Parliamentarism has long been ready for its downfall. We will sound the death knell for it. I've already had enough of this comedy. But also, kind of in the in the current kind of context, we see the same preoccupation, the same concern that that the goal of extremist parties is to modify and unrule and undermine the norms. Here is a statement from Susanne Ruttrich, an SPD deputy. You have declared war on us, and we have accepted the war of Democrats against non-Democrats. And Patrick Schneider, deputy of the CDU-CSU, what we experience on the part of the AfD is a termination of everything that is parliamentary norm in this institution. You have pulled off the mask from your face, and what we see is the grimace of the non-Democrats, die Fratze der Undemokraten. And I'll end with quotes, but just to motivate and to set up the the context. Physical obstruction is intended to keep the parliamentarians themselves from doing their work through noise, through violence, and through a climate of threat. This is Marco Buschmann, FDP. So here's just some just some kind of descriptive evidence showing that this is indeed happening, that this is not just some alert sounding kind of politicians. So here we have sort of, right, I mean, we have used sort of, right, all the parliamentary speeches. This is like not the last, but the penultimate kind of parliament when sort of, right, the AfD was still present. And we sort of, right, we've coded the sort of, right, the informal, by which we sort of, right, all these kind of interruptions sort of, right, contravene the Geschäftsordnung. And we see sort of, right, kind of a high level of sort of, right, of kind of, you know, in forms of sort of, right, interruptions, shout, Unruhe, Gegenrufe, verbal remarks, counter responses, and so on. And it is not just, I mean, this is just a total count. Of course, one has to normalize by the number of kind of politicians. And so sort of we see that sort of, right, a large part of them come from the AfD, but it is also important that the mainstream parties respond through this, to these strategies through kind of something that we call in another paper the counter-provocation. They provoke and we counter-provoke, right? And sort of, and this is not in my talk, but this is kind of, you know, something that I am also with Kishan, we're studying and we're trying to understand what happens sort of in this dynamics of provocation, counter-provocation, and who are the mainstream politicians that are counter-provoking. But that's not the goal of the paper. The goal of this paper is to move beyond this, beyond these informal changes, and to look at, you know, sort of, right, the strategies, the sort of, in a way, the more formal and the more institutional strategies that mainstream parties can pursue towards extremist parties. And this is kind of, you know, I'm sort of my building block, a simple kind of typology that in a way motivates this talk. So sort of, right, so even if after what I say at the end, you know, you're not convinced, I mean maybe kind of this is something that you can sort of leave after today's talk. So one can think of sort of, when I sort of started this project, I sort of tried to think of the strategies along two dimensions. One is you can target individual politicians, individual extremist politicians, or you can target them collectively. You can sort of, right, focus on kind of, you know, making changes within parliament, or you can kind of modify the access into parliament. Okay, so let's just sort of put things in this kind of 2x2 typology. Right, so you can, and I think a widely used one, sort of an individual sort of strategy within parliament is the calls to order, and I will show you immediately that this was the preferred strategy in Weimar Germany. Sort of like Paul Löbe, who was the kind of, you know, the president of the Reichstag, he was just sanctioning them individually, and he thought this would be enough to restore kind of parliamentary order. On the other hand, you can kind of change the whole sort of, right, set of procedures. You can sort of, right, and kind of, you know, increase the power of the police. You can sort of, right, increase the sanctions on extremist politicians and so on. And we will see there's legislation of this type, but it is adopted in some cases and not in others. So we want to understand sort of, right, this mix between individual and collective. Sort of, right, one strategy that I'm really interested in is sort of immunity. You can take away the immunity of extremists. I mean, that is sort of, right, a very important kind of, you know, tool that mainstream parties have. Why is this underused politically? I mean, that was the question that motivated me in this project. I mean, sort of, right, why go to the party ban? We just had a fascinating kind of paper here on the sort of, right, on the why go to the party ban that is normatively so problematic? Why not use immunity? And so we're going to look at sort of, right, the trade-off, but that's sort of, right, something that I think kind of even in the current context, I mean, kind of, you know, this is something that one can kind of consider. Or one can change the electoral law, and again, as I said, sort of, right, one can specifically modify, this is sort of, right, a more defensive militant democracy. Again, so we're not going to the party ban. But we can modify the electoral law. And we see sort of, right, in France, both Third Republic and Fourth Republic, immediately kind of that was activated, right? They didn't have to go to the party ban because they had this instrument of changing the electoral law. So that is the sort of, right, the set of kind of strategies that I want to study in this project. And I'm trying to sort of, right, to characterize the kind of, you know, the kind of the coalitions and sort of, right, the conditions under which, you know, politicians would support these strategies. And sort of, right, I'm kind of building, I guess, on sort of already a great literature by Giovanni Capoccia. So, right, I mean, who's pivotal here? Well, pivotal is the party next to the extremist, right? I mean, kind of that is the sort of, right, I mean, this is the party that we first need to focus on and understanding sort of under what conditions do they want to engage sort of, right, and activate one of these policies. So the first, in a way, choice that these actors have, and so then it depends, of course, on the nature of the extremist. Is the extremist the communist parties? Is the extremist of party on the right? In the first case, the pivotal party are the socialists. In the other case, the pivotal party are the center-right parties. But the first sort of right choice that this party has to make, or this kind of legislator has to make, is whether or not to demarcate. And by what I mean by demarcation is something super simple. Okay, and I put this to make it kind of comprehensible with standard kind of models, right? So we have sort of right the quadratic loss function, but it is weighted by this parameter d. So what does this mean? It means kind of, well, this party is going to draw a line here, okay, where sort of right the utility of this legislator or this party will be 0. So no matter what, if the extremist party puts a policy here that is very close, okay, to the sort of right to the policy of the mainstream party, the party is still not going to take it, right? We're going to demarcate. We're going to call the extremist party as democratically illegitimate, and as a result, we're not going to kind of engage in cooperation. Whereas this is a sort of is a more demarcated party, right? And this party kind of this interval is broader, so as a result, this party is likely to kind of to engage in some sort of right cooperation with the extremist party. So the first choice is whether or not to demarcate. For the purpose of the empirical analysis, I'm going to sort of exploit exogenous shocks. I'm going to exploit external shocks that lead to this demarcation. And particularly in the case on parties on the left, these are kind of positions on the Soviet Union that are sort of externally kind of imposed, that make then the sort of the center-left party kind of demarcate. And as a result, kind of sort of agree with sort of with the other mainstream parties on the center right on kind of some sort of right strategy on the left. So sort of so the key question, I think, and I hate that such a fuzzy concept is at the center of the theory, but there's no way around it. Okay, the key kind of question in a way that we need to understand is this kind of demarcation issue. It's sort of do you want to draw this sort of demarcation line against kind of the extremist party, and sort of and under what conditions do you do this? Okay, and then sort of we have different coalitions depending on where the extremist party forms, but sort of from the point of view of the empirical analysis, what I want to use today is to show you that sort of if the mainstream party is not demarcated, it will favor individualized strategies of parliamentary defense, meaning it's going to go to the calls for order, it's going to kind of try or not to use to money, but it's not going to engage in the more costlier and the more sort of in a way, I think they are more effective sort of strategies such as the electoral system change. Whereas if the mainstream party is demarcated, it will favor collective or systemic strategies of parliamentary defense. And that is sort of, and this is, I'm using this to get at this kind of French-German comparison, where the French socialists were strongly demarcated against the communists. And as a result, they pursued much more aggressive strategies much earlier, okay, as soon as kind of, these disruptive parties emerged, whereas kind of, the German SPD, for reasons that I'm going to explain, were not demarcated. And as a result, kind of, sort of there is very, very little action. So that is sort of where this is going. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go sort of through the cases here, but I'm sort of we have sort of the variation even within these cases over time when the sort of the relative demarcation changes or not. So let me just sort of give you an example, sort of start with the Third Republic France. Okay, so we have the kind of the Communist Party, the sort of the formation of the French Communist Party in 1920. And we have sort of this external shock, the formation of the Third Communist International, and the effort of Moscow to take completely over the Communist Party, okay? And Moscow advocating sort of for the kind of communists to reject all bourgeois legality and sort of and the communists should prepare to overthrow capitalism. What is the response of the center-left party? The socialists demarcate from the communists beginning with 1924. So beginning with the first election, they refuse every sort of electoral cooperation with the communists. And this demarcation leads to further kind of, sort of in a way, systemic kind of choices of democratic defense. The French socialists were a strong supporter of proportional representation. I'm sort of this was, okay, sort of the issue of sort of the French socialists beginning sort of with the 1870s, sort of I mean, throughout the Third Republic until 1919 when French adopts PR. Once sort of the communists emerge and once sort of the left is demarcated from the communists, okay, the position of the French socialists changes and they support the majoritarian system as a way to block the communist vote in runoffs. So there's as early as 25 a special Congress of the Socialists, okay, accepting this strategy, and the reintroduction of the majoritarian elections with runoffs in 1927, okay, sort of right, a very quick, political response in an effort to block, okay, the kind of the communist candidates in the second round. This is the roll call vote of the sort of right of the adoption of the reintroduction of the two-round majoritarian system in 27, and as you can see, sort of right now, the socialists are on the side of majoritarian institutions, and the sort of right the policy is opposed by the kind of the communists, okay, who still remain advocates of proportional representation, and on some kind of candidates on the right who sort of feel that they will not be able to make kind of these second round coalitions, and as a result, sort of right, they will be better off under proportional representation. Another sort of right collective sort of strategy immediately sort of again that necessitates a demarcated center-right party, center-left party, are sort of right changes in the rule of the chamber. Okay, again to kind of to weaken the disruption. And again, the point I'm trying to make here is that this is again something that comes from the left. The reforms are spearheaded by Leon Blum, okay, strengthening the role of the parties in limiting the speaking time, right? You take away the speaking time of the sort of right of the communists who disrupt. You create this institution that then survives in the Fourth Republic, La Conférence des Présidents, that allocated kind of speaking times across parties. You reduce the possibility to submit amendments that, again, was a strategy of obstruction, and you reduce speaking time after the submission of amendment. Now, immunity is very, very strongly protected in France, as you know, okay? Right, this goes back kind of to the French Revolution. And it's very interesting because kind of in French legal doctrine, immunity is considered a right that protects parliament as an institution rather than individual politicians. So in the first sort of right, there are efforts, of course, to take away the immunity of communists, okay, but sort of right, this constraint is binding. However, sort of right, the situation kind of changes in 1940 after sort of right, the beginning of war, okay, sort of right, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, okay, sort of right, the communists being kind of now enemies of the Republic, and as a result, kind of there is this intervention, right, there is this law that is being passed unanimously, okay, to take away the immunity of all communist deputies. Okay, this is a measure adopted with unanimous support. So again, the activation, okay, of this sort of right, of this policy instrument, I mean, you could think of this sort of maybe a quasi-party ban, because you take away sort of right, the entire immunity. Now the contrast to Germany, just the opposite. Okay, so this is Paul Löbe, as you know. He was the leader of the Reichstag, okay, sort of right, for the entire period until 1932. Okay, the SPD is the largest faction, but the SPD is not demarcated towards the communists. Okay, there's constant membership changes across these parties. There are some kind of coalitional government at the regional level. There's some common parliamentary and legislative initiatives. Okay, so weaker demarcation. So as a result, we see a reluctance in using kind of these collective strategies that you see in France. Okay. So what is sort of right? What is Paul Löbe's kind of preferred strategy to deal with the disruption? Is these individualized strategies? He's calling them to order. Okay, sort of right repeatedly. I will show you the data in a minute. Okay, so he's using here kind of these rules of procedure that sort of right, members can be excluded. Okay, so the call to order can be somehow costly, right? I mean, kind of you're excluded for 8 or 20 days. You lose your income. I mean, that is sort of, I guess, a costly sanction for the kind of the communist deputies. Okay, under what conditions? Well, these are sort of right the factors that may lead to they may trigger the Ordnungsrufe, use of verbal violence against members of parliament or members of government, anti-Semitic slurs, incitation to disorder. Okay, so I have this data now that I will show you. There's 1,400 calls to order, right, in Weimar. There's 20 in the Third Republic, okay? This is definitely used here and not France, okay? And sort of right, and until 1932, and this is sort of right how the data looks like. Okay, of course it's peaking kind of, after 1930, after sort of right, I mean, we have sort of right 101 members of the NSDAP. Okay, the disruption, for the most part, I mean, until sort of right, we have a high numbers of far-right deputies, right? The disruption comes mainly from the left, okay? But then sort of right, we have this period of sort of right, what Sartori calls polarized pluralism, and sort of right, we have disruption on both sides. So when does Löbe use this? Using kind of a, again, nothing causal here, just the correlates, okay, sort of, right? It's not, I really thought this is minority governments, okay, but not significant. Okay, okay, I guess it is sort of, right, on these politicized issues, right, when do the kind of the extremists disrupt? Mostly when we have sort of, right, I mean, kind of, you know, parliamentary immunity issues of stake, executive, sort of constitutional reforms, executive orders. Less so on the kind of on the policy questions, right? They were closer together with the communists, and they were not sort of, right, initiating this strategy. But what is interesting, again, in a kind of in a comparative perspective, is that sort of, right, the collective, the sort of, right, more effective strategies were completely ruled out by the SPD. Okay. And so we see sort of, right, beginning with the early 1920s, as you know, and that is maybe a case that kind of the current students forget, right? That sort of, right, we see this movement, we see this effort to replace the electoral system, to replace proportional representation with a majoritarian system, as in France. And sort of, right, and the argument was, well, the lists were too long, parties could hide demagogues on the list. How about we move to the district where there's only one candidate, we know that, and then we're not going to have the Goebbels and the Goerings anymore in parliament, because kind of we're going to have, like, you know, a stronger accountability, okay? These proposals originate with the DDP and the Zentrum, okay, so parties on the right, okay, so right, are proposing them, but they never sort of, right, make it kind of through parliament, and in fact, the SPD is even unwilling to put them on the sort of, right, on the table for discussion. Okay, they don't reach the plenum of the right. You can read them in the sort of, in the kind of, you know, the meetings of the governments, but not sort of, right, they never sort of, they always fail. And as sort of Chancellor Poynting remarked, the failure to change the electoral system was the largest failure of the Weimar period. And where sort of, what was missing from that majority? The SPD was missing because the SPD was really unwilling, okay, to sort of, right, to contemplate such a remarkable strategy. Okay, and again, sort of on these other collective strategies, the changes that sort of I discussed in France that were introduced, sort of, right, changing in the procedures to limit disruption, okay, to limit frivolous amendments, okay, they're all rejected. At the time, they are discussed and rejected. They're in the paper. There's a paper in CPS that is out there. And it's interesting that Löbe himself, sort of, right, when he's trying to explain kind of the reluctance of his faction to consider this, he refers to the history of repression that the SPD had experienced as a sort of source of, you know, unwillingness to consider something, okay, so draconian, if you want. I'm not inclined to tighten these procedures. I've spent more than 9/10 of my political activity in opposition, and I'm of the strong belief that the opposition needs freedom of movement, okay? So no change in collective strategies. Until 1930s, and just very weak ones, okay, sort of, right, introduced kind of in 1931, that are sort of sanctioning higher sanctions for interruptions, okay, that's sort of, right, that the kind of, in a way, the mainstream democratic parties agreed on. And on immunity, okay, we had just discussion before. It's quite interesting that sort of, right, that there is no, this tool is not used at all, right? And in part because kind of the SPD refused to have any changes in immunity, as this could be applied to proximate KPD, okay? And so this is sort of, right, the full data set. Sorry, it's kind of small print. The bottom line is that sanctioned politicians, right, it's very, very small. It's this last column, okay? It's just sort of, right, only beginning with 1928, but generally kind of, you know, sort of, right, a very, very weak kind of, you know, use of this strategy at the time. So different responses to parliamentary disruption, more militant in France than in Germany. And the variation, I think, can be explained, okay, by the sort of, it's actually like, it's quite interesting that the variation is a function of the responses of the center left. And this kind of contrast, sorry, it's not, it's the socialists, okay. So let me just briefly move to the Fourth Republic, which again gives us the same sort of, right, in a way, dynamic. Okay, but again, to sort of highlight how we can kind of identify sort of, right, the periods of demarcation. And as you know, sort of, right, we have this sort of, right, the first 2 years, okay, when the sort of the socialists with the MRP are in kind of coalitions with the communists. Okay, and that gives proportional representation and all these kind of other sort of, right, reforms of the first year period. But this coalition breaks down. How does this coalition break down? Again, it is the Moscow kind of, you know, strategy. It is Moscow which creates Cominform in 47. Moscow which presses the kind of the communists to reject the Marshall Plan, to reject kind of, you know, sort of, right, the plans kind of, you know, for the sort of, right, for the European Union that sort of that are being already discussed here. Okay, and Moscow wanting the communists to organize a mass insurrection. Okay, and the communists accepting their strategy. And it is at this point that the socialists demarcate, and this is sort of the speech by Leon Blum in 1947, 2 months after this kind of the Moscow hard line. International communism has openly declared war on French democracy. Within France, a party has constituted itself whose objective, okay, and perhaps its only objective, is to dispossess the sovereign people of their fundamental right. I'm here to sound the appeal. And that demarcation is the first step, and it is followed by the choice of a collective strategy of parliamentary defense. And again, what is the left doing? Again, it's shifting its position. Again, it's changing the electoral system. It's replacing PR with a majoritarian system. There's lots of negotiations. It's very complicated to have the sort of right MAP agree. But in the end, kind of, sort of right, they enact this electoral law. Okay, that sort of right, that that require kind of, sort of right, that require kind of, second round coalitions that actually give an extra bonus, okay, to lists, okay, sort of right, a majoritarian bonus to lists that are national. Okay, so basically kind of, and sort of right, creating the possibility to coordinate against the kind of the Communist Party. Okay, so sort of right, so very similar to the Third Republic. Okay, sort of right, in terms of the sort of right collective changes in parliament, we see the same, we see the, in a way, the rediscovery of these rules that had been adopted in the Third Republic, okay, to give greater responsibilities for this kind of collective institutions in sort of right, in stopping kind of the interruptions, the amendments, and so on and so forth. And also sort of right, a strong kind of, if you think about it, sort of right from normative theory, a strong kind of, reduction of the rights of individual deputies to submit amendments. So everything they can to stop kind of, the disorder of communists. And this is sort of right, passed by all kind of, all parties with the exception of the communists. But in the case kind of immunity, they are, even though they are trying, I mean, sort of as I said, sort of right, France has this strong protection. Okay, and on this occasion, kind of, there is very little very little success, right? You see almost 500 cases directed against communists, okay, trying to take away their immunity, yet sort of right, yet this tool is underutilized. And maybe kind of the biggest, sort of right, I mean, kind of the most symptomatic case is this sort of right, is this trial of the communist deputies, which takes place kind of, sort of right, it's a 1-year trial in which sort of right leading kind of, figures are sort of right, I mean, the proposal is made by, by the prosecutor to take away their parliamentary immunity. And this sort of right, I mean, kind of the chamber in a narrow vote, okay, sort of right, defeats this proposal, okay. And, and sort of right in a way, again, I'm giving you here this kind of this legalistic kind of justification, trying to say that, well, maybe immunity is the wrong tool to get at this problem. Because what are we going to do? We're going to take away the immunity of 4 or 5 communist deputies, but we're not going to do anything about the party as a whole. So this is Jean Mingeot. He's the sort of socialist in the Immunity Commission. And he said it's not the charges against 4 or 5 deputies that will achieve this goal as long as the Communist Party continues to exist with its troops, cadres, cells, and groupings. Okay, and in particular, as long as it has at its disposal the powerful means of expression that is the gallery of the parliament. So maybe something collectively, maybe that is sort of right, I mean, towards what he's pushing, maybe a party ban. But he thinks there is a mismatch between this kind of this tool and the sort of right and the sort of right the party as a whole. And now I'm going to get onto very difficult political terrain. Sort of right. I mean, this is evidence that we have. I mean, with Kishwan, we found in sort of trying to understand, sort of right. Okay, sort of right how. Okay, sort of right how the the ban against kind of the Sozialistische Reichspartei sort of right came about in post-war Germany, given that there was no prior kind of sort of right I guess collective strategy in Weimar. So initially, sort of right again, sort of right thinking about sort of right the logic that I'm trying to propose here. You need a demarcated center right. And when we look at the kind of the records at the time, kind of it is clear that sort of right that both the CDU and the FDP in the first years of the the post-war period were completely non-demarcated, And as you see here, a statement from Justice Minister Thomas Dela, I'm ready to stand for the legalization of the SRP with sufficient material in the parliament. They were not demarcated, and they were ready to kind of to allow kind of the sort of right, the existence of the sort of right of the fascist party. So what is changing is kind of one, this election in Niedersachsen and sort of right where you see the Sozialistische Reichspartei having 11% of the vote. Okay, but even at that time, even after this election, kind of, the CDU minister president is willing to form a coalition with the, with the sort of SRP, so not demarcated yet. And it is the American pressure. It is the pressure. This is how we read the historical kind of evidence. It is the pressure of, John McCloy, U.S. High Commissioner, threatening Adenauer that Americans will intervene in domestic matters if necessary. Okay, that sort of leads to this shift in position. It is only at this very late point in time that the CDU demarcates, okay, and is kind of ready to sort of to take a more kind of militant action against kind of the SRP, okay, and as a result, sort of these events, I don't need to explain them here, but it is of course, they are also then, kind of strategic and including kind of, a similar ban on the KPD. Okay, and an effort to appeal to their kind of right voters who think, sort of maybe we're going too far in banning the kind of SRP. Okay, okay, and here the last point is that there's also sort of a much stronger change in immunity in the post-war period than we see in France. In France, they cannot activate this tool. There's this legacy of sort of of the protection of immunity as a protection of parliament. And it is kind of, in sort of Germany, beginning with these cases that we are now kind of researching at the moment, okay, that's sort of that this connection between kind of protecting immunity as a protection of parliament is being broken in these kind of cases in the early 50s that paved the way for seizing the immunity of far-right deputies, both sort of on the sort of the far right, but also of communist deputies. So in a way, Germany kind of, sort of activates this tool in a much stronger way than France is in the post-war period. So I don't need to summarize. I just want to say that I think sort of what I'm trying to do in this project is to think of a broader menu. So just not think only of party ban only as the only thing that sort of that is in the literature, and actually to broaden. Maybe I'm leaving things out. I would be curious to hear. But I think kind of this literature, we've had this early discussion earlier, is just so focused on the party ban. And if you think of sort of the set of strategies that mainstream parties can adopt, there's much more at stake. And I think what we need to do is understand the trade-offs among them. Okay, there's sort of a multi sort of set. I'm focusing on 4 here, but there's much more. And sort of and you see sort of in each cases they kind of they are sort of there's institutional sort of reasons, protections against some that cannot be activated. But I think kind of to make progress in this literature is sort of is just to broaden the menu of strategies that we can use, both in parliament, but also sort of in sort of outside of parliament. So thanks.